Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my History 152 courses at Purdue University North Central. For this lecture, we will only examine the Gilded Age and Progressive Era so that we can see how the eugenics movement morphed into another movement, sterilization. Those who believed these ideas some were ordinary Americans. Other folks were people in positions of economic and political power who could influence the lives of average Americans. Before listening to this lecture, you should have some basic information about the Gilded Age, especially the effects of immigration and urbanization. Part 1 of this lecture will provide an introduction and a discussion of one aspect of eugenics. Then in Part 2, I will discuss sterilization. Prior to the Gilded Age, universities did not offer PhDs in history, which is the basis for college education in the United States now. Mostly wealthy men from the dominant culture wrote historical books. These men might be trained in the law or possibly religion, but overall education changed after the Civil War. In the Gilded Age, universities started to form into disciplines as we know them now, learning how to train professors from the German system of education. Out of that, we got history, sociology, and so much more. As American historians got their training, they tried to explain how the United States formed and why it was so special. Herbert Baxter Adams, one of the first German-trained doctorates of any fame in this country, described a process known then as the germ theory. The Teutonic races of Germany migrated west, taking with them a love of conquering and planning democracy, and brought their germ of democracy to England, which then migrated to the Americas with the Brits, who settled in the first colonies. While we learned a story of the king's so-called tyranny over the 13 colonies prior to the Revolution, the English had a great amount of liberty compared to most nations in the world. This is significant because the rights of Englishmen and the precedent of Parliament helped to form a new phase of democracy that could be traced back through descendants in Europe. Francis Walker in 1896 echoed these sentiments when he said, "The entrance of such vast masses of peasantry degraded below our utmost conceptions is a matter which no intelligent patriot can look upon without the gravest apprehension and alarm. They are beaten men from beaten races. They have none of the ideas and aptitudes such as belong to those who were descended from the tribes that met under the oak trees of old Germany to make laws and choose chiefs." I put this all in the context of history, or the discipline of history, so that you can see that there was a set of ideas floating around the Gilded Age that intersected. Without knowledge of DNA, American scholars had to use all the disciplines, history, sociology, medicine, etc., to try and explain what was wrong with the newest group of immigrants coming to the United States. And you would have learned about these folks in your Gilded Age lessons as the new immigrants. Out of this movement, we also get something known as nativism. Nativists preferred the old immigrants for various reasons and proposed solutions to eliminating the influence of the new, less desirable ones, and this made a huge impact on the United States, as you'll see. We also get to see the rise of a popular movement known as eugenics. At this time, as this graphic indicates, the disciplines emerging out of the new university system, from the social sciences to the hard sciences, validated racist ideas. Eugenics cloaked bigotry, discrimination, and racist policy in the mantle of science and fact. Without an understanding of this movement, it is difficult to understand why Gilded Age and Progressive Era Americans held fast to what we would think of as outmoded ideas in periods of such rapid advancement and progress. Americans did not need science, however, to discriminate against immigrants. Thus, it is important to consider previous movements of nativism. Since the 1840s, there had been groups of people pretty invested in hating immigrants coming to the United States. It started with the Irish, but by the post-Civil War era, it expanded to a full-fledged nativist movement. These folks based their judgments on their perspectives as WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Even with that said, there were people who came to dislike the influence of immigrants for specific and different reasons, and from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, the issue of race became more and more prevalent. Let's start with anti-Catholic or even anti-Jewish nativists. For most of the nation's history, the majority of the population had been white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. These are the folks that came over from England. We learned about them in the first part of the class. And colonists and early Americans imported their biases against Catholics with them from England. Religious and racial minorities had little to do with the construction of the nation's political and economic traditions. In the 1890s, anti-Catholicism declined somewhat and religious discrimination shifted towards Jews. We can also consider radical nativists, or I guess we could say anti-radical nativists. Immigrants occasionally found themselves under attack for political as well as racial and religious reasons. There were enough foreigners involved in labor protests and wrote in support of socialism and anarchism that nativists labeled foreigners as radicals to be feared. The Haymarket riot of 1886 had been a labor protest turned violent by a bomb thrown into a crowd. Several people were killed and anarchists were blamed for the bomb. In the North and West, miners, railroad workers, and factory workers went on strike and were met with violence by employers with the assistance of government. People feared more protests by people who supposedly wanted to overthrow capitalism, but really workers just wanted more control over their lives in terms of wages and conditions. And then we can also kind of look at nativists in terms of racial nativists. The ideas of these folks mostly came from books and articles written by scientists and college professors. For example, Edward Ellsworth Ross, a sociology professor at University of Wisconsin, wrote The Old World in the New in 1914. He characterized the new immigrants as subcommon and who would cripple the American population if they bred with natives. This brand of nativist used scientific-sounding theories to prove inferiority and superiority, especially using cranial volume and IQ tests. They also subscribed to theories such as social Darwinism. Here you can see a few images trying to represent the hierarchy of races or differences between superior and inferior races. The image in the middle is the ideal. This would be the basis for the wasps. And then on the left and the right are two races that were considered inferior. And here's another image that also gives a clear hierarchy of who is considered best. And the wasps would have considered their legacy from the Greeks. The images are different but simple. Some people are better than others, and we can tell that by just looking at them, in their minds, that is. Skull shape, skin color, and other facial features were all evidence of these superior and inferior characteristics for people at the time. All of these folks operated under the belief that human beings could be distinguished by various races. Without the knowledge of DNA, scientists had to combine the science they had at their disposal and observation of traits, which often included cultural and environmental adaptations. But since then, we have disproven the idea that there were people different enough that they could be divided by categories of race. So let's be very clear here that there is no scientific justification for the term race, except maybe human race versus animal species. Despite that, people in the past did believe this and made some important decisions based on those ideas. And unfortunately, we still use the term race to identify people despite its unscientific underpinnings. We can go back to 1758 when Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist, established the classification system still in use for various forms of life. He listed 4 categories that he labeled as varieties of the human species, including Homo European, Homo American, those would be American Indians, Homo Asiatic, and Homo African. To each he attributed inherited biological as well as learned cultural characteristics. Since then, there have been similar categorizations basing racial distinctions on skin color and other visually apparent traits, location of birth, and behavioral traits. Despite the fact that today most scientists reject the concept of race as a valid way of defining human beings, the term and the stereotypes persist without end. In history, we had the oversexed drunk Irishman, suspicious and dangerous but hardworking Chinaman, the lazy Mexican, and the black Jezebel, and so on. These are terms that we consider derogatory, but they are stereotypes that are still in use. Science nicely confirmed racism in the past, and these cultural traits allowed scientists and lay people to rank people into racial hierarchies. Therefore, science justified hatred, discrimination, and other forms of mistreatment of other human beings. As historians, we cannot really judge them, but we can try to understand their context. With the idea of race established since the 18th century, scientists tried to advance their understanding of it using the research done by Charles Darwin, Gregor Mendel, and others, creating something brand new known as eugenics. Until the 1930s, eugenics was considered a science, but to most of us now we would call this a pseudoscience. It sounds scientific, but does not meet the rigors of a true science. An Englishman, Francis Galton, first defined eugenics in 1883 by applying statistics to the problem of human heredity. In 1865, he proposed that humans take charge of their own heredity, and by 1883, he invented the term using the Greek for good birth, or good in birth, eugenes. Europeans and Americans knew quite a bit about improving horses, cattle, and sheep through the effort of scientists and agricultural societies, and Galton defined eugenics as, quote, the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to the questions of judicious mating, but which takes cognizance of all influences, end quote. And this would, of course, create better races, just like refining animal breeds. People quickly caught on to the idea of creating better races of people. Galton thought that it was inconsistent and unwise to be concerned with animal heredity while leaving human evolution to chance. He advocated for methods to influencing human genetics, what scholars call positive and negative approaches. And in terms of positive approaches, that's more about mating. By having good stock individuals mate together, they could increase the number of quality people in a society. This meant that these folks should produce more children, avoiding birth control that would stall these positive efforts to create better people. Negative measures could guarantee that poor genes did not proliferate. Inferior people, the quote, unfit, unquote, needed to be identified and kept from breeding either on a voluntary basis or forcibly using birth control and sterilization. Galton was not the first to consider these ideas, but his writings emerged at a time when both Europeans and Americans began to fear the idea of race suicide or race degeneration. These fears came about because of the developments of science and the historical events that brought conflict to America as immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe became a visible part of urban populations beginning in the Gilded Age. Of course, in terms of science, Darwin had written On the Origin of Species in 1859, introducing the idea of natural selection that caught on after the Civil War in the United States, especially with his 1871 book on human evolution, The Descent of Man. Scholars added to Darwin's work, and then in 1900, Gregor Mendel's work on heredity gave eugenicists everything they needed to promote this new science. Not only did certain species evolve and prove to be stronger than others, scientists believed that hereditary material was impervious to environmental changes. The only solution then was good breeding. Organized eugenics movements appeared in Germany in 1904, in Britain in 1907, and then in the United States in 1910. So these ideas have been floating around, but whether they became organized or not depended on the place and time. For the U.S., this scientific evidence only confirmed what some Americans had already thought about the immigration changes in the U.S. in the mid to late 19th century. The new immigrants, or the so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and the Chinese, and later the Japanese, were clearly inferior in the minds of these folks. But what was more disturbing were the birth rates, or it is more accurate to say that reformers were disturbed because they thought these immigrant groups had high birth rates. The working classes in the cities were producing the largest families, while WASP families were producing smaller families. Why? Because middle-class folks had access to birth control, which was generally illegal after 1873 because of the Comstock Law. But these folks could get access to it through other channels, or they could delay marriage. The cities were full of immigrants, crime, and disease, so the connections seemed to be so easy to make without knowing the real science behind all of it. The best way to create a better stock of people, for many Americans subscribing to these ideas, was to encourage WASPs to propagate. How to encourage them came in different forms depending on the time period, but as more women were starting to pursue advanced degrees, some Americans also became concerned how this would affect their ability to become mothers. In the 1870s, more and more women from the middle and upper classes were going to college. A lot of this has to do with the rise of coeducation. A major revolution in education made college accessible to the middle classes and to women within that economic status. The Morrill Land Grant, the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 gave land grants to states to build colleges for training in agricultural and mechanical arts. These are sometimes referred to as A&M schools. Also, many state schools started with the Morrill Land Grant Act. All of this allowed for the, quote, co-education, end quote, of women alongside men. Prior to this, college education was for rich men whose families could afford the Ivy League universities and the loss of family laborers. After the war, states began building these schools that one historian dubbed democracy's colleges. As women began to go to school beyond elementary or high school, people started to wonder how women would fare physically. Dr. Edward H. Clark was the most concerned and did a quick study and determined that because women had limited energy, their success in college would drain their ability to produce children. Blood to the brain would in effect leave the uterus to shrivel up. Since these women came from the better families in the nation, this could, of course, lead to race suicide. The fact that he was a doctor allowed his ideas to gain some popularity, but the women's movement had been growing over the past 25 years. Young women wanted to go to college and knew that his ideas were bunk. Suffragist authors refer to him as Dr. Clark, but my guess is that they said it with a chuckle. Women doctors and social scientists wanting to disprove Clark's ideas followed the lives of female graduates. They studied them, and Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi won Harvard's Boylston Prize in 1876 for her essay, The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation. Slowly but surely, research showed that what women already knew. They could handle having a brain and a uterus at the same time. So why did Clark get so nervous and people buy into his story? The answer is easy. Darwin. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that The Descent of Man was published in 1871. Darwin had a lot to say about races, but he also argued that women were inferior. Again, here we can see how culture diluted science. Women had a socially inferior place in society because of cultural ideals and ideals such as separate spheres. If you have already come across this term, you know that before and after the Civil War, Americans started adjusting to the new demands of cities by assigning men and women different roles. Women were to stay home and supervise families and their needs, while men were to go and work for wages. This was an ideal that suited middle-class Americans well, and it also meant that men and women should have different characteristics. If you need to review these ideas, please see my lecture on women's suffrage and reform for the History 151 course. But the overall point here is that Darwin, as a product of his time, put together ideas that did not reject his cultural background, but support it. Thus, he assigned differences to men and women in terms of evolution based on what he already believed about the two sexes. So you can see why some people who already were a part of this culture might buy into Dr. Clark's ideas. This is the end of part 1. Please see part 2 for a discussion of negative eugenics and the conclusion.